Congressman Ryan, taking a few minutes out of a very busy morning here, the morning after the debate. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
last night. I want to
Thank
begin
you.
by getting your perspective on how it went. And let me also ask you this question. You talked a lot about unions. Not a lot of the other candidates did. You went in with a very specific message. You were there in a very specific lane. So your sense on how it went last night, and why did you look to put the emphasis on some union representation, specifically here in Michigan?
Well, I thought it went really well. Lawrence O'Donnell and others on MSNBC last night were saying they thought that I won the debate and did really well, so I'm happy to hear that. But it was focused on the workers. I mean, I just think as a party, we talked about a lot of issues last night. We weren't talking about the workers, not just union workers, but workers across the board. Wages have been stagnant and it's been really hard for people to keep their nose above water. That needs to be the focus. How do we get to the new economy, create the new jobs? Talked a lot about creating a chief manufacturing officer so we can build our way to reverse climate change through electric vehicles, solar, wind, and all that. How do we create good paying jobs there for these workers?
Let me ask you a bit more about the chief manufacturing officer. You brought up before, it was something that you mentioned again last night.
Yeah.
I really want to drill down it for our viewers who may be unfamiliar, maybe they're first hearing that concept from you for the first time.
Yeah.
What are you envisioning for the specific role, and how does that person contribute to a potential Ryan agenda?
Yeah, so they would, chief manufacturing officer, report directly to me in the White House and help us organize how we dominate sectors of the economy, kind of like Germany does, China does the same thing. How do you use the government to work with the private sector? So Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, maybe the Department of Defense. How do we work with the private sector to dominate the electric vehicle market? There's going to be 10 million electric vehicles made in the next 10 years. I want half of those made in the United States. You got to have an agenda, someone engineering how we're going to do that, and then cut the worker in on the deal. Do the same for the batteries, do the same for solar, do the same for the charging stations, do the same for wind, and that manufacturing officer would do that and then drive those investments into communities of color. Old textile communities, old steel communities, old coal. How do we start knitting this thing back together? I think you need somebody in the White House that's going to drive that.
The state of Michigan, where you and I are right now, as well as your home state of Iowa, by my count, those are two of the 6 states that voted for Obama regularly, that then voted for Donald Trump. When you're hearing what the progressive candidates are offering last night, specifically in a city like Detroit, specifically in a state like Michigan, I mean, what is your sense on the values that matter to American voters, specifically in this part of the country, and what you're getting from some of your Democratic colleagues who view the process forward so fundamentally differently than you do?
Well, we need to focus on wages, economic security, those issues, injustice issues. Last night, the conversation was that Senator Sanders and Warren, how are we going to take private insurance away from union members, for example, who have negotiated health care? They want, through their single payer initiative, to come in and take those private health care plans away. They talked about decriminalizing someone coming into the United States and saying that it shouldn't be a crime. They should just be able to walk into the United States. I think if you're going to come in the United States, you should at least have to ring the doorbell and ask permission. And then the other one was free health insurance to undocumented workers in the country, when most Americans are out there fighting their rear ends off to try to pay for their own family's health care. And they're sitting there listening, wait, you're going to come take my private insurance, you want me to pay for someone else's health care that's an undocumented person in the country, and people should just walk into the United States without any criminal penalty. I think the vast majority of people in the country are sitting there going like, wait a minute, I'm here struggling. The undocumented worker, I think they should get health care, but they should have to pay for it like everyone else does.
So, because wasn't at that moment at that first debate, I don't know if that was the night that you were on stage back in Miami, but there was a question to all the candidates posed about providing health care services to undocumented immigrants, and virtually all of them had their hands up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what's your reaction that you got candidates who are kind of voicing that? I mean, how do you see that registering with a lot of skeptical Democratic primary voters?
I think it's dangerous position to be in. Our focus needs to be on helping working class people make ends meet, the people who take a shower after work, a person who's out working, they've got a student loan payment, they got a high rent payment, but there's no affordable housing. Like, that should be everything we're talking about, and we're getting on these other issues, and it's like, what are we talking about here? This doesn't even make any sense to me. You
and I are here in the heart of downtown Detroit. Not far right up the street is the iconic GM building, but they're closing a plant this week up in Warren, Michigan. It's about 22, 23 miles or so. As well as any member of Congress I've ever had these conversations with about the dips that auto manufacturing is facing in this part of the country. What's your reaction to this, that this debate is coming on the same week that GM's closing down that plant, and your message to Americans who are reading these headlines and are concerned about specifically auto manufacturing in a state like this or a state that you come from?
Well, what's the future? I mean, let's talk about the future. Obviously, I don't like the fact that this system is so screwed up that General Motors cuts workers, closes plants, and their stock price goes up. I mean, that's a busted system that we need to fix. So I believe that we need to talk about manufacturing of the future, electric vehicles, batteries, and all these things, and then drive those investments into these old General Motors facilities, into these old communities. To me, that's the solution. That's why I'm so focused on this chief manufacturing officer that can really drive this agenda for me.
My final question for you, Rep, and thanks again for joining us the morning after your debate here. When you look ahead to the September debates in Houston, the DNC has sanctioned those that they're going to be a lot more competitive to get on, whether it has to do with the number of small dollar donations that are required to make that debate stage or national polling. If that does not work in your favor, what happens to the Tim Ryan campaign for the White House moving forward after yesterday's performance in Detroit?
Well, we're going to see. You know, all your viewers can go to timryanforamerica.com, make a small contribution to the campaign if they think what I'm saying here is making sense, if they want the party to go into the direction of jobs and work and all of these things. And we're going to just work hard the next 6 weeks or so and try to raise money, get low dollar donations, get our poll numbers up, which I think that we should get a little bump out of this, and then we'll see where it goes.
Actually, I lied. I do have one more question. How important is it for you to have...
I'm supposed to lie to you. I'm the politician.
Well, here's an important question, because we've interviewed you so many times. How important is it to have that? I mean, do you use the word moderate to describe it, or a centrist? That's what people in the media say. But how important is it to have someone with that viewpoint still represented on these debate stages moving forward?
Well, I think it's going to be really important. But as I said last night, we got to get out of this left-right thing. It's just not working anymore. We've got to get in the new and better. That's why the electric vehicles. I talk about trauma-based care in schools and social and emotional learning. I talked last night about regenerative agriculture and how do we move from an industrial ag to regenerative ag. New and better, not left and right. And somebody, if we're going to beat Donald Trump, needs to be in the new and better lane. That's the lane I'm trying to capture.
Congressman Tim Ryan, every time you and I sit down for an interview, I think to myself, I ran out of time and I have so many more questions. Today's no different, but we have to leave it there.
Thanks.
And we'll do it again when we get back to Washington.
All right, man. Take care.
If not Houston or somewhere else. Thanks for joining us.
Great to see you. I'll be